The aftermath. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. It is now Tropical Storm Ian that is hammering northeast Florida. Winds are still tracking around 70 miles per hour. The center of this now tropical storm moves off the coast, may become a hurricane again for what it's worth. But Ian is, because it will regain some strength and head towards South Carolina, where it will make landfall in the United States for a second time, and our experts expected to do so as a hurricane. The devastation it has left in its wake after slamming into Florida as a powerful Category 4 storm has been catastrophic. The death toll is feared to be in the hundreds, if not higher. We don't know a lot on that front yet, but it potentially makes Ian the deadliest hurricane in Florida history, and Florida's had its share of deadly hurricanes. Throughout the day, we've been getting new images of the damage and desperate rescue operations that are underway in the southwest Gulf Coast of the state. This afternoon, the governor, Ron DeSantis, delivered an update on the state's emergency response. More than 800 search and rescue teams are now operating in the state, according to the governor's office. The Fort Myers fire chief says his department conducted more than 200 rescues overnight in that city alone. This was the scene along the coast in Naples. Yeah, that is not supposed to be a waterway, where first responders had to use an axe to free a woman who was trapped in her vehicle as fast-rising floodwaters caught many drivers by surprise. Further inland in Orlando, a reporter covering the storm became a rescuer himself, carrying this woman on his back out of chest-high water. In Bonita Springs, a group of Good Samaritans rescued this elderly man from his vehicle after it became submerged in floodwaters. And we have this new video today that shows how Ian ripped apart portions of the Sanibel Island Causeway. Look at this. Is it going to be usable anytime soon? This will hamper efforts to reach those residents that are still on the island who decided they would not evacuate before the storm. These Barrier Island residents were told they must evacuate or they won't get rescued if they need it. Others are going to be prioritized. Governor DeSantis described the destruction on Sanibel as biblical. New aerial images show some of the devastation elsewhere in Lee County, where at least 9 hospitals have no water, and that's according to the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell. President Biden spoke by phone this morning with the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, and he approved a major disaster declaration for the state. The president also visited FEMA here in Washington this afternoon, where he issued this grim assessment of the situation from his purview so far.
This could be the deadliest hurricane in Florida's history. The numbers are still unclear, but we're hearing early reports of what may be substantial loss of life.
And while Ian continues to devastate Florida, the governors now of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina all have declared states of emergency ahead of the storm's anticipated arrival this week. Forecasters say it could strike South Carolina tomorrow. So let's get more on all of this. We're going to start with Blaine Alexander. She's in Orlando, where the massive amount of rain from Ian is causing flooding there. And I'll also have NBC meteorologist Samara Theodore with me to focus on the latest on Ian's track. But let's start with Blaine in Orlando. And the great fear, Blaine, is that that this storm could sit on Orlando, causing all sorts of water and flooding issues. Luckily, it moved a little bit faster than anticipated, but what are you seeing there?
Well, we're seeing some of the flooding issues right here behind me, Chuck. I'm in downtown Orlando right now. We're on Robinson Street, and the water that you see behind me that has now spilled over its banks into the road is Lake Eola, of course, aided by hours of nonstop rainfall. Let me show you a little bit of it. I mean, I think this kind of illustrates the bad news, but also a little bit of the good news. I'll get to that in a bit. But we're seeing a number of scenes that look kind of like this as you drive throughout Orlando, where there are officers having to block sections of road. You see that car down there. That's a car that unfortunately was stalled. We've seen several of those driving along as we've gone from place to place here in the city as well. But when I say the little bit of the good news, it's because the water is receding relatively quickly. The rain has slowed significantly here in Orlando. It's certainly still coming down. We're still getting wet, but it has certainly slowed, and that's good news. You know, when we first arrived here, the water was covering the sidewalk. That's not the case anymore. It's now moved past that officer car. The unfortunate thing is, though, that Chuck, that we've seen a number of rescues, a number of last-minute rescues from here in Orlando from mobile homes. About 300 mobile homes had to be evacuated. A neighborhood with about 30 or so homes had to be evacuated. We're seeing all of these kind of popping up at the same time, officials told me. In fact, one big one that caught a lot of folks' attention today were images from a nursing home, an elderly senior living facility, where essentially they had to go in and painstakingly, one by one, remove many of the 100 residents, all as the water was rising. I spoke with the assistant chief who was in charge of that operation. She says she's been with Orange County Fire and Rescue for some 24 years. Because of the sheer number of rescues happening at the same time, this has been the most challenging hurricane that she's worked, Chuck.
Yeah, it's such a massive storm and so many people impacted. Blaine Alexander monitoring the situation in Orlando for us. Blaine, thank you. Let me move over to Samara, who's got all of her gadgets. She's at her big map and board. So let's talk about the future of Ian here. The expectation is that it hits as a hurricane. How powerful do you expect it to be when it makes landfall this second time, Samara?
We talked about this yesterday, Chuck, and right before that alert came out, you said, Samar, could this strengthen? And at the time, it looked like it was maintaining that tropical storm force. But, you know, the water temperatures here are above average. And so there is a pretty good chance that we could see this make it to a Cat 1. In fact, we're already at 70 miles per hour right now. So just a few miles per hour away from being a Cat 1. And it's in free ocean right now at this point. We're seeing some of the heaviest rain making its way into the Palm Coast. Daytona Beach has been suffering from heavy rain and flooding as a result. But let's take a look at the trajectory. So here we go. It's got enough time meandering, moving to the northeast at about 8 miles per hour, and that gives it enough time to strengthen. And right now, in the cone of uncertainty, we have Charleston, and we have a lot of coastal cities. This is a hot spot. Even beyond that, moving into South Carolina, we're expecting some heavy rainfall. And I do want to note the timing on this. Friday at 8 a.m., just before, or I'm sorry, during that critical time of the morning commute, we're going to start to see the heaviest rains moving onshore near Charleston. And just around lunchtime, we could see this make landfall anywhere between these two lines.
Sounds like what you're saying by giving those timelines. If you are in charge of county government or schools in Charleston, you'd be shutting things down tomorrow?
Absolutely, especially tomorrow morning around lunch. I would avoid it because flash flooding is going to be a big concern in this region, and that is one of the most dangerous situations you can get outside of storm surge, and they'll be seeing that as well because of course, they're a coastal city. And look at the map here. We've got this moderate risk stretching from Charleston to Myrtle Beach, and the amount of moisture that is just going to, be pushing into South Carolina, Greenville, a lot of hot spots here.
Samara, it seems that what is the potential here? Here's my fear, that this thing comes in and somewhere along western Carolina, eastern Tennessee, it just sits there and dumps rain. Is this going to keep moving through this part of the country and get back out to sea, or do we have to risk flooding issues in eastern Tennessee, western Carolina, and places like that?
Well, wherever this storm goes, Chuck, it's a powerful storm. Flooding is going to be an issue. But as far as it stalling out, we do have other weather mechanisms at play in the atmosphere that'll keep it moving. But this means it's on tour at this point. And everyone from the Carolinas up into the mid-Atlantic, where you are right now, you're going to be seeing heavy rain out towards the Delmarva Peninsula through Saturday. This is going to be impacting many people's weekends plans farther north.
All right, Samara, this is some storm. The fact that it's going to hit the United States twice as a hurricane, that doesn't happen very often. It shows you how powerful this Ian was. Samara, thank you.
Absolutely.
And, of course, Blaine Alexander before that. So joining me now is the fire chief for Fort Myers, Tracy McMillan, who says his department has made around 200 water rescues since last night in that hard-hit city. So let me ask you, in the full light of day, you've almost had an entire day of sunlight after this storm has hit. Do you expect to be making more water rescues, or are we starting to see some water recede?
Yeah, we actually went out for those rescues last night. So, us being, the city of Fort Myers, we actually had the wind speeds die down, somewhere around 10 o'clock or so. So our crews actually went out, roughly around, 11 o'clock, 12 p.m., to actually make those rescues. So today we weren't making rescues because they were made last night. So today we're actually working on taking care of the human.
All right, I just lost the audio there. We will come back to him when we get a minute. I have somebody else on the line here, Rob Gaudette. He's the founder and director of the disaster relief organization known as the Cajun Navy, whose team is already in Fort Myers, also helping with rescue efforts there. Look, technology is tough, so I know our viewers are going to be are going to be patient with us here. What are you seeing today? You were obviously there when water. I assume we've seen some receding of the water. What are the rescue efforts looking like today versus yesterday?
We're still doing rescue. We started early this morning. My team drove in from Tampa, where we stationed initially yesterday. And they got in here early this morning and started doing rescues. They're still out there in Sanibel Island going and helping people. There's a need for a lot of boats out there right now. So that's what they're doing right now. I'm in Tampa. I'm sorry. I'm in Fort Myers.
Right.
Over my shoulder, there's a pile of about 50 large boats.
Yeah.
We're assessing the community for how we can help out in the neighborhoods here for an extended period of time with our Safe Camp concept, where we provide distribution services to the community where, there's no power, no water. We help them with those services until, businesses get back online.
What are you hearing from people is the biggest need? If government officials, which I'm sure you're in contact with, because I know you don't want to get in the way, you work with them. But if you were to ask to pass a message to government leaders, what would the message be right now locally? What's the first need, second need, third need?
People in the vulnerable situations are going to need food, water. I heard World Central Kitchens here already serving food. That's the most important thing, food and water. People need to gain a sense of stability for their lives as soon as possible. The storm's over, but in many ways, the storm's just beginning for so many people that are being thrust into crisis. That's where the Cajun Navy really excels. Right. A lot of people know us as a search and rescue organization. What we will do also is show up and help people get through the storm and get through the crisis that's been created, where their homes are damaged or destroyed. And help people by cleaning out homes and so many other ways.
Rob, you've seen a lot of devastated areas, a lot of devastated cities, a lot of devastated towns. I know it's hard to compare any storm to another, but Fort Myers, you're practically in the heart of where this storm hit. Can you compare it to other devastation you've seen?
Yeah, I will tell you the trees here are very different than in Louisiana. Lots of palm trees. We're seeing palm trees down. I'm standing in front of several oaks, a willow tree that's down in front of me. It's the same when you have a windstorm like this, Ian was, and then the water storm combined that makes the ground wet. Lots of trees are pushed over, some on houses, some across roadways. It's a very manual effort. In many ways, it reminds me of Hurricane Laura. We were there on day one, driving through, clearing trees off of roads. It's a very similar. Then the water intrusion here is different than Hurricane Laura. Lake Charles didn't flood. Right. So here you have a wind event combined with a flood event. And the crisis truly is just beginning for so many people. I really want us to understand that the debris can be fixed. Getting people's hearts and minds back on track is a big challenge as well. And we got to remember that.
Look, it's tough to get over. My mom's lost everything twice in hurricane related stuff. It's tough to get over losing those things. Yes, it's just things. You change your mindset over time. But in the moment, that's hard to get over in the moment because you feel like you've lost your memories. And I know you deal with that with a lot of people, Rob.
Yes, sir. That's right. We have a story of a woman from Lake Charles. I talked about Hurricane Laura 2 years ago. It probably will compete with Ian as one of the strongest storms to strike the United States. One woman lost everything. She carries a brick from her home around because it's where she had, family Christmas parties. Her children were born there. It's memories. Yep. And, the roof can be put back up. Lives cannot be replaced, and certainly memories cannot be replaced once they're lost.
That's true, but they are just things, and there's something about that brick probably matters a lot. Rob Gaudette with the Navy, Cajun Navy. Really appreciate you sharing your perspective with us. Let me bring back Tracy McMillan, the fire chief for Fort Myers. Tracy, I think everybody has patience with us when it comes to technology right now, given the situation you're in. So just walk me through, if you went through when Charlie came through Fort Myers, how would you compare the situation?
Much different. Much different. I have a lot of respect for Charlie, but Ian actually took the bar up to a whole nother level. So such a big storm, but a very slow-moving storm. So it actually had, in my opinion, a lot harder effects on our area, and especially on our city. When you see the destruction,
how, you put labels on what catastrophic is, but when you see it, is it just full levelings? Are you seeing neighborhoods just washed away? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so, in the city of Fort Myers, we're just seeing, on our coastal area, of course, actually throughout the rest of the city, but really on our coastal area, we're seeing stuff, boat docks that are, a half a mile away in our downtown corridor. We're seeing, boats on roadways. We're, seeing cars pushed over. So heavy surge, palm trees, they can just say that, can just see where they bowed to the winds that they came through, and many of those snapping and going into the roadways, and roofs torn off and things of that nature. So, catastrophic would be a great word for that.
How many barrier islands is your department supposed to service, and are you able to get to any of those barrier islands?
So we're not a barrier island. We're actually the city, kind of on the mainland, if you will. Yeah. So we actually butt up next to the barrier islands, Pine Island and Cape Coral.
So you don't have jurisdiction. You don't have to. That isn't your department.
No, sir. That's not our department that handles that. So we actually have on the other side of the bridge is where we actually kind of start our work and our recovery efforts.
Would you say this is going to be, when you look at and you're going to in your own way be a part of this cleanup effort? Is this months? Is this years?
Oh, it's years. Yeah, it definitely is years. So, these are the recoveries that take a long time, a lot of resources, a lot of dollars, and a lot of rebuilding. And that's one of the messages we're just trying to tell our communities, is that we have to be patient. We're not going to fix it today. We're not going to fix it tomorrow. This is going to be a long-term effort to rebuild our communities.
What kind of rescue efforts are you having to conduct today? Are there people still fighting, sort of trying to escape dangerous situations because of structures they're in, or are you past that part of the search and rescue?
So we're past that. Last night around 11 o'clock, going into the midnight hour, is when Ian actually had passed us to the point where we could get back out there. So we actually went out last night, and that's when we did those rescues, taking our militarized vehicles, with our police department, and getting people out of harm's way and clearing roads. We actually ran a house on fire where there was a gentleman who was actually burning candles just to have a light, and his house caught on fire. So last night was extremely busy as far as the response phase, whereas today, having put those efforts in and clearing roads, we're able to actually kind of assist in a different format to start looking at the human aspect and infrastructure.
I assume another worry you have is generators that cause fires. I mean, we know a lot of people get generators, and sometimes they don't necessarily know how to operate them. And sometimes that becomes a secondary problem that you have to deal with. Are you running into this?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that, always make a response and recovery challenging. There are some folks who actually will try to, lack of a better term, jerry-rig a generator where it actually backfeeds the electrical system. And then there's others that will take their generators and try to actually pour gas in it while it's running. That's definitely a challenge. And of course, obviously the other subcategories when they actually put it inside their home, and then we start dealing with carbon monoxide type challenges. Obviously people want to protect their property, but you can't have it inside your residence when you do that.
For the most part, do you feel like the community is cooperating, and are you hoping people that did evacuate, when would you suggest they come back?
That's something we're still kind of working through. We have, the open opportunities in the city for folks to start coming back, start working the recovery process. I will tell you, myself and the city manager, assistant city manager, took a drive this morning, and it was refreshing to see people out there actually working together, being thankful for their level of destruction, because they know there was others that may have been, worse than them. And so that was refreshing to see that people had an attitude of being thankful and an attitude of working together as a community. And that's actually something that helps us get through these times.
Boy, it sure does. And hopefully it gives people, no matter how caustic things get in our politics, that actually when our life's on the line, we will look out for each other. Tracy McMillan,
That's right.
the fire chief for Fort Myers, thanks for coming on and sharing your observations with us.
Yes, sir. You have a great day.
Coming up at this hour yesterday, my colleague Ali Velshi was in the midst of the significant storm surge in Naples. He was reporting as the conditions were rapidly deteriorating around him. Up next, we're going to hear from that area's emergency response chief about what's been happening in the hours since the storm came ashore, and since hopefully the storm surge receded. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
America woke up this morning to images like Naples, Punta Gorda, and Cape Coral submerged underwater. Homes across Fort Myers that have been torn from their foundations, and boats that have been found blocks away from where they were moored.
Welcome back. That was the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, just a few hours ago. Some of those images she was referring to include these floodwaters in Naples, Florida, which just simply inundated cars in just a matter of hours by a record storm surge from Ian. Officials in Collier County, which includes Naples, say they have received some reports of deaths, although we have no confirmation of just how many people there died. And I will just warn everybody on death toll numbers. I think these are going to be very hard to get accurate numbers, probably for days, if not even a few weeks. Joining me now on the phone is Dan Summers. He's the Emergency Services Director for Collier County, which contains both Naples and Marco Island. And let me just start with, we heard the FEMA director give that visual explanation or observation of what she saw. Give me yours. I know you've been around the county. Tell me what you woke up to this morning.
Well, we are all on the same page with our FEMA administrator and with Chief McMillan up the road here from us. So without a doubt, I think what really is noteworthy here, where you go back and look at what Hurricane Irma did to us 4 years ago or so, and then you compare what we went through today, and we certainly didn't get the wind fields that our next door neighbors in Lee and Charlotte County did. But our storm surge inundation, which we were all watching the models, we were watching this challenging parallel track where we knew just a few miles at the last minute would make a difference, and the last few miles did in fact make a difference. So record-setting storm surge inundation that any of us can possibly remember. And it's in this scenario where wind was not too bad, but floodwaters storm surge levels were just really almost impossible to fathom.
Dan, how long have you been in the county? It says a resident or in the area.
Right. My 34th year in professional emergency management, starting in coastal North Carolina, and 19 years here in Collier County.
So you've seen your share of storm surge. You've seen Collier County hold up in other storms. So pay me, what were some things that you saw that you didn't think you'd see?
Well, I think what we really are surprised to see is that we all understand the force of moving water. What really took us away, and even what I compare to coastal North Carolina, was how fast we saw the surge. Now, it was, was it a half hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or water backing up from some of our drainages and some of our local rivers and streams? But that was exactly the case, was just how quickly water piled up and backfilled or infiltrated right along what we call the A evacuation zone, that immediate coastal zone. And it was really kind of mind-boggling of the time. Now, you're in a disaster, and time is variable, but the intensity and that right angle off the storm that we were getting, this onshore flow, was really remarkable.
Look, Mother Nature's undefeated. Okay, so the idea that we can, you can mitigate, you can do your best to prevent worst case scenarios. When you see this storm surge, can you imagine what could have helped at the time? Is there anything now that you're learning how fast this storm surge came about? What preparation could have helped? in your mind?
Well, right, and we have been alerting our public. We are very vocal about we have a beautiful community, but we're very vocal and realistic about hurricane preparedness. And we have taken mitigation and elevation seriously. So what we have is not dramatic structural loss where we have elevated structures, where we have older structures and we had water infiltration into the first floor. Yes, that was tough. But we've not lost many roofs and we've not lost many shingles. And we don't have a lot of debris to pick up. But in this case, with the sand and the overwash deposited, and of course, yes, we have conditions of flooded homes and that water that backfilled so quickly. But in this case, and much like the chief said, this case has been, at least in Collier with the lower wind speeds, has really been a flood event.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is, as a coastal community, you'd be a lot more comfortable being in basically a home on stilts.
Well, that's right. And where the water got to move without restriction, we did fine. Where we unintentionally had other barriers, that's where the damage occurred.
Dan Summers, I know this is only beginning. You heard probably the chief from Fort Myers say he thought it would take years to recover from this. Do you have any reason to contradict that?
Well, I would say, first of all, the structural damage in Lee and Charlotte County is almost hard to believe.
Yeah.
We don't have that level of structural loss, which is very fortunate. So do we have a lot of cleanup, a lot of drains to clean out, and those type of things for sure. We think we'll finish all of our search and rescue efforts by dark this evening. So a little different scenario, and a few miles made a world of difference, and that's certainly the case with our good friends in Lee and Charlotte County. Well,
there's no good way to handle a storm. Do you want too much wind or too much water? You don't want either. But it sounds like you're saying at least you dodge the wind. Dan Summers in Collier County, really appreciate you sharing your observations with us. So thank you, and please stay safe.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much.
You got it. Up next, we're going to take a turn to what may be the biggest global story of the day. What is happening here with Mr. Putin? You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to the developments in Ukraine. The Kremlin says that Russia will formally annex 4 Russian-occupied regions during what they're calling an accession ceremony tomorrow for the so-called voting in that sham referendum, because it's now complete. Meanwhile, Russian civilians are fleeing the country in hopes of avoiding the draft. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow issued a warning yesterday that Americans in Russia with dual citizenship may be conscripted into the Russian military. And Finland announced that they will be closing their border to Russian tourists at midnight after nearly 17,000 Russians crossed the border over the weekend. But catch this. In a televised address to his National Security Council today, Putin made a rare admission that mistakes were made following his mobilization order, telling his security officials that those mistakes need to be corrected. And now NATO is formally calling the damage to the Nord Stream pipelines an irresponsible act of sabotage, adding that deliberate attacks against allies' critical infrastructure would be met with a united and determined response. A lot of action, a lot of moving parts here in the current war between Russia and Ukraine. Joined now by Mike McFaul, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, NBC News International Affairs analyst. And Mike, I always try to make you help us understand what is going on in Putin's head. Never an easy task. But yesterday, you and I were talking about, boy, Putin has had to say some things and make some moves in the last 2 weeks that just seem, almost desperate. And then he follows it up with today, admitting this mistake on the draft. What do you make of it?
It's new, Chuck. He doesn't like to say he's wrong. He doesn't like even to say his lieutenants are wrong. And he admitted that they made mistakes. They drafted the wrong kind of people. Too many people have been gathered up. He's decided that we have to return the misfits, to paraphrase what he said today. But I think it underscores he's under a lot of pressure right now. This move tomorrow is historic, tragically historic. It is more annexation in the heart of Europe. It's clear that it's going to happen. He's annexing, the size of Portugal tomorrow to be part of the Russian Federation. And he knows that there's going to be a backlash against that. He seems pretty stressed out to me right now.
I mean, nothing seems to be going right for him. Again, I mean, you and I talked on my podcast earlier this week about, I feel like some of this started when he had his security conference with China and India and a few other countries, and he had to admit publicly that China and India weren't thrilled with what he was doing in Ukraine. He seems to be grasping here for something. What's he doing next, and how would sabotaging these pipelines actually be a good idea?
Well, I think what he's doing next, and again, I don't read his mind and we don't correspond, and so with all those caveats in place, but I think what he wants to do is he want to annex these 4 territories, seize them. He doesn't control them right now. Remember, there's fighting in 2 of them right now. But then he wants to say, all right, we're done. Let's have peace. I have my land. You're showing it right now. I've taken my territory. Let's sue for peace. And then he wants to see how the West will react to that. So I think that's his next big play. With respect to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, I don't know. I don't want to speculate. It's very striking what NATO said today, that this is an attack on their facilities. But we haven't learned yet who they think who has done the attack. And so let's wait till we have definitive information about that before thinking about what the response might be.
I understand, but Mike, the fact that NATO would have to respond to an attack on one of its member states' infrastructure, no?
Yes, exactly. That's why I think they're being, that why we're waiting to see who are they going to actually say did these attacks. I think that's a very big step for them to take.
Putin seems to think, right, the general assumption is if he can scare the European West, and I say European West, he knows he's not going to scare the American West, but if he can somehow rattle France, rattle Germany, rattle some of these countries, but what evidence that he's going to do this? I mean, whatever past history there was with Germany and France, it seems like Macron and Scholz are on the same page here with Biden.
Well, you're absolutely right. He's trying to scare the West. When he talks about nuclear weapons and the threat of using them, that's actually deterrence. He's saying, if you escalate, I will respond. And it's working. Let's be honest. He has deterred the West. He has deterred NATO from providing certain kinds of military systems to the Ukrainians because of that fear of escalation. So that has a very practical and I would say very clear-cut objective. The bigger issue is, can he scare the West into stop supporting Ukraine and pressuring Zelensky to sue for peace? And that we don't know yet. I am impressed by the opposite, just like you said. Yeah. I'm impressed by the unity of NATO so far, not the disunity.
What do you make of the Russian Foreign Ministry basically saying, hey, we're ready to start talks on New START with the United States? I know we're a believer in constantly sort of, all right, well, we've got to have a nuclear arms agreement over here, even if we're in the midst of trying to push back at them. But should we? Is this the time to engage them or not?
Chuck, it's a tough call, but I think we should. Because I think it's in America's national security interest to have an arms control regime in place, extending the New START treaty, than to not have it in place. So you just got to think, what is our interest? And our interests are caps on their nuclear weapons, number one, and two, the ability to inspect where those weapons are, to gather intelligence about Russia's nuclear arsenal. I think that's in America's national interest, and we should have that negotiation, but we should not allow the Russians to link that negotiation to any other issue. They'd love to do that. They'd love to say linkage, right? We'll only talk to you about arms control if you do this and that and the other for us. We can't allow that kind of linkage to happen.
And one would assume if we're engaged with them on a nuclear arms treaty, at the same time they're saber rattling, right, about using a tactical nuke with Ukraine, and even Ukraine's president saying their intelligence indicates that this is a very real possibility. And given the comments that Jake Sullivan made this weekend, it certainly seems like American intelligence believes this is a very real possibility. So how do you balance that?
I think the beginning of that negotiation is to remind Mr. Putin that in January, he with the other P5, the other nuclear powers, signed an agreement at the United Nations, lots of fanfare, saying Nobody will ever use nuclear weapons. They're to deter war, not to be an instrument of war, and to make sure that he's still committed to that. And the second thing I would be doing if I worked for the Biden administration was trying to get Mr. Xi Jinping to communicate quietly exactly that same message.
Ambassador Mike McFaul, as always, sir, I learn a lot when you're on this show. So thank you for being on the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Up next, Ian downgraded for now to a tropical storm, but the threat is obviously far from over. Ian is still dumping heavy rainfall, as much as 2 feet in some areas across central Florida, northeast Florida, and get ready, the Carolinas may be in its path as well. Before we go to break, I want to take a minute to note the passing of a longtime CBS newsman and a friend of mine, Bill Plant. Plant spent more than 50 years with CBS, including 35 years as the network's White House correspondent before retiring in 2016. During his long career, Plant covered some of the biggest stories of the 20th century. He interviewed Martin Luther King during the march from Selma to Montgomery. How's that on your resume? He earned awards for his coverage of the Vietnam War, fall of Saigon, and he covered everything from presidential elections to the death of Jimmy Hoffa. I'll tell you this about Bill Plant. Anybody who was in that White House press corps loved having Bill Plant as a friend. And if you're traveling overseas, there was nobody who would tell you the best wine to get at dinner than Bill Plant. He was a great reporter, a great resource, a great friend, and a great person. Bill Plant was 84. Welcome back. Let's turning back to the storm, which is on its way to becoming a hurricane again as it makes its way to the Carolinas. Orlando, Daytona Beach, and Jacksonville right now are all experiencing heavy rain and winds. We're also seeing some heavy flooding in St. Augustine. And in the coming days, we expect the storm to pick up strength over the Atlantic and make another landfall in South Carolina, likely as a hurricane. But again, this could become a significant rain event for the Carolinas. Shaquille Brewster is on the ground for us in Jacksonville, as Duval is part of his beat, even when it's not politics. So, Shaq, tell me what you're seeing there. Obviously, Jacksonville not getting the wind damage, but the fear in northeast Florida has been flooding. What are you seeing?
Exactly, and that flooding continues. That flooding threat continues. I just had a conversation with the mayor who said they're breathing a sigh of relief, but he's telling people not to let down their guard because there's still another high tide scheduled for overnight. And then they said that flooding threat here in this area could continue well into the weekend. So I think the biggest data point, the biggest point that he made that shows you how folks are feeling in Jacksonville is that the fire department is sending some of their urban search and rescue teams to Central Florida. They did that this morning. They sent them to the Orlando area. So that's the sense that you're getting. It's not to say, and you see some of the pictures on the screen right now, it's not to say that Jacksonville was spared by the effects of this storm. They did have downed trees. They did have downed power lines. There were about 22,000 people who lost power, but that power was restored by at least noon for the vast majority of those people. So they're breathing a sigh of relief, but they're not out of the woods completely yet here in Jacksonville, Chuck.
And then there's St. Augustine. We're seeing these pictures, and I know you haven't had a chance to get over there.
Yeah.
Looks like St. Augustine, it's getting worse. I know you've gotten a few calls in. What have you learned?
Yeah, and look, this is the difference between where we are, Duval County, and St. Johns County, which is where you see St. Augustine. Here in Jacksonville, there were not any mandatory evacuations. There were voluntary evacuations of low-lying areas. St. Augustine, that entire city within St. Johns County, that entire city had mandatory evacuations. And looking at those pictures that are on screen right now, you get a clear picture of why that is. Yeah. These are areas that flood on a regular basis. When we look back, and something that local officials pointed to regularly was Hurricane Irma and the effect that Hurricane Irma had on this area, where you had hundreds of rescues in the Jacksonville area, tens of millions of dollars in damage. They were fearing that level of water, that level of flooding. Well, St. Augustine got closer to what they expected, and you're seeing some of those pictures now. But according to some of the local reporters in the area, that water is receding. But again, goes back to what the mayor told me here in Jacksonville. There's another high tide scheduled for overnight. So just because you see things and it may look okay, don't think it's okay to go back now, because it's going to be a little bit more dangerous when the lights are down, when the sun is down, and you have that water still rising.
I tell you, it's nice to hear, Shaq, when you hear that St. Johns County made it a mandatory evacuation. Every storm teaches a lesson, and it's nice to know that emergency management leaders learn the lesson and apply it to the next storm. Anyway, Shaquille Brewster on the ground for us in Jacksonville. Shaq, please, as always, stay safe. So electricity, it's obviously a key concern in any storm of this magnitude. So joining me now is the Florida State President of Duke Energy. It's Melissa Satius. And let me just ask this. You guys, obviously, FP&L is the larger provider of power. The power outage totals is about 2.6 million overall. I know Duke Energy, I guess you guys have about 600,000. Walk me through what you're dealing with and which areas you expect to get power to first and which areas are going to be the hardest.
Sure. So Duke Energy Florida serves about 35 counties, about 2 million customers. Hurricane Ian, starting on the Gulf Coast, of course, impacted the Tampa Bay area the most, highly populated, kind of first after the landfall. It then proceeded east to the East Coast. So we have right now about 680,000 customers without power. We have been able to restore service to about 180,000 customers from the beginning of the storm. And so we are seeing the most progress over in the Tampa Bay area, so Pinellas County, where we've been able to go out and start with damage assessment and actually begin restoration kind of at the same time. The hurricane, because it had been so slow moving, it really was only hours ago where it was starting to make the exit. We were starting to see the winds die down that would allow our crews to get out and begin the damage assessment. So this storm, because it has moved more slowly than others, has kind of changed a little bit of the approach that we've had to take in our normal storm procedure. But we recognize that every storm is different. Each one has different characteristics. So we have been able to respond appropriately.
Let me ask you this. I know Duke Energy is a larger footprint in the Carolinas. The Carolinas is now in the path of Ian coming there. I know, I marvel at how power companies share resources to back each other up depending on where the natural disaster is. But you tell me, I mean, how concerned are you that you guys might get overwhelmed? Carolinas, Florida, does that slow down this process?
It does not slow down the process. It just means that we have to be, prepared. And we go into every storm season recognizing that a storm that starts in the Gulf of Mexico and impacts Florida could certainly come up and hit the Carolinas. We've seen this before. And so one of the great benefits of being part of a large electric industry company like Duke Energy is that we're able to tap into those resources. So knowing that Ian could end up exiting Florida and hitting the Carolinas, the crews that we tapped into to help restore here in Florida are our Midwest Duke Energy colleagues from the Midwest, from Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this. There was a big push for years in Florida to bury the power lines. It's not done everywhere, but they're more successful in Florida than other places. Can you talk about the difference between communities that have buried power lines and communities that don't when it comes to restoring power?
So we do have obviously a mix of overhead and underground facilities, and quite often, historically, most of the underground facilities were done for aesthetic reasons. But over the past several years, the Florida legislature passed a law that allowed utilities like Duke Energy Florida to have a really robust storm protection plan. And it's a long process, but it's one in which we are both converting overhead to underground in very susceptible areas. We identify those areas based on data, historical outage data. But it's also flood mitigation at substations. It's more wind resistant wire, stronger poles, elevating pad-mounted transformers. So it is a big part of protecting our grid and ensuring that we are able to restore service to our customers.
I'm just curious, if you have buried power lines, are you probably going to get your power on faster?
Not always necessarily, Todd, because the reality is there are things, underground is susceptible to the environmental condition as well, whether it's flooding. We can't get into places that are flooded. The underground, therefore, is impacted, de-energizes. I've even seen in the 35 years that I've been here with the company and been through many storms where trees can be uplifted by wind and an entire root ball of a tree can completely pull underground out from underneath the ground, underneath the top layer.
So a tree can take down a power line even underground. It can do it
underground.
Do it on top and do it underground. Melissa Satius, the president of Florida State's Duke Energy, thank you for coming on and sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you.
Still to come, a professional hurricane hunter who's flown directly into nearly 24 hurricanes says Ian was the roughest flight of his life. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we've said and many have said, Hurricane Ian was one of the strongest storms to ever hit the state of Florida. One of NOAA's hurricane hunters, who are the scientists who routinely fly into hurricanes to collect data, said the flight into Ian's eye was the roughest ride of his career. Take a look at some of the video he shot of his bumpy ride.
Oh, there goes the signs. There goes the beds. Holy cow. Oh!
So I'm joined now by that hurricane hunter you just saw in the video, NOAA aerospace engineer Nick Underwood. So Nick, you've flown into a bunch of them. What is the ride? Is there a normal ride through an eye of a hurricane?
Typically, we define it as sort of like being on a wooden roller coaster that's inside of an automatic car wash. So there's a lot of vibration. You're expecting to be bounced up and down. There's wind and rain slapping against the windows. Our flight yesterday morning into Hurricane Ian, though, there was a lot more lateral motion, which is a lot more unnerving when you're in an aircraft. And that's what really caused those bunks to slide out in the back. Coffee splashed everywhere. Some of our instruments got loose and were rolling around the cabin. It was a sporty ride up there.
So when you look at the measurements you took through the ride, what did you learn about Ian that now that lateral movement, is there something unique about Ian because of that? Is there something in your measurements that you learned from that based on your ride?
So we're collecting data the entire time as we're flying through these storms. We're collecting flight level data. We're launching instruments from the aircraft that are collecting temperature, pressure, humidity, wind speed, wind direction. We have radars on board. All of that data is getting fed to our good friends at the National Hurricane Center so they can update those forecast tracks. At our flight level, we were seeing winds of like 150, 160 knots. Flight level winds are, of course, a little bit higher than they're going to be down at the surface, but it was still a pretty impressive storm. We were in there right as Ian was intensifying up to its peak Category 4 strength.
When a storm becomes a hurricane, how often does someone like yourself, how often does NOAA send a plane into the eye?
So we'll fly storms if they're threatening land, whether that's the United States and its territories or our friends down in the Caribbean and Central America. We'll also fly storms if they just have research value. And we'll fly anything from an open tropical wave making its way across the Atlantic all the way up to a Category 5 hurricane.
So how often so a storm like Ian, you've flown through it once, it's about to form again. Is it worth going back in?
We, the NOAA hurricane hunters, we're done with Ian for now. I believe our counterparts over at the Air Force 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, I think they're doing some flights later today to sample Ian as it moves back off the coast. But prior to Ian making landfall in Florida, our crews had started flying it back last Friday as it was still working its way across the Caribbean. And we were doing 24-hour operations, pretty much having a plane in the storm all the time, gathering all of that life-saving data.
What is the flying into a storm like that, right? Most pilots are trying to fly away from a storm. Do you try to fly over it and get into it that way? Or is there a specific way you go into a hurricane in order to get into the eye?
So we've got two different types of aircraft that we use to hunt hurricanes. One is our Gulfstream 4. That is a high-altitude surveillance jet.
Okay.
That one is flying up above, around, and in
It'll
front
be
of the
above
storm.
a hurricane. Okay.
Exactly. But we also have our P-3 Orions, which is what I was aboard in that video.
Got it.
Those are aircraft that are flying only about 8 to 10,000 feet above the water, and we're crashing through the eye wall into the eye of the storm. So we go in on a perpendicular track and just try to make our best way through.
Well, I guess it gives a whole new name to turbulence. Nick Hunter, one of the NOAA hurricane hunters, thank you for sharing your experience with us and sharing your expertise. And thank you all for being with us this hour. Our coverage of Hurricane Ian and the aftermath from it continues right now with my friend Hallie Jackson.